It's been claimed by certain self-professed Marxists that being trans is a manifestation of idealism, that so-called trans ideology is anti-materialist, supposedly relying on something similar to René Descartes' famous statement, "I think, therefore I am," where thought is the starting point of existence rather than matter. Materialists would generally invert that to "I am, therefore I think," signifying that matter exists prior to and independent of thought or perception. Now, if you're new to the left and haven't studied Marxism or philosophy in any great detail, it'd be easy to be a bit dazzled, maybe even overwhelmed by these statements. The notion presented is that in the case of people identifying as a certain gender, fields are being placed over reals, might appear to be a valid criticism from a strict materialist perspective. And if, as a result of deep conditioning by class society and its superstructural apparatuses, you've already got some latent transphobic tendencies, this may be taken as a green light to legitimise reactionary antagonistic positions towards trans people, cloaked behind a thin veneer of Marxist-sounding terminology. The error here should be fairly clear, but we'll return to it later anyway to fully dismantle it. Conversely, you might instead be someone who starts from a position of support for trans liberation, and this assertion you encounter that being trans is idealist may evoke a completely different response. With the best of intentions, you may throw your hands up and say, well, I suppose materialism just can't explain everything. Let's just set materialist analysis aside for this particular topic. Maybe idealism's better for certain issues. And that's the end of all inquiry. No need to think about it anymore. Trans rights and we're happy out. But well-intentioned as this is, it presents a problem for us. Marxism is an all-encompassing worldview. The basic premise of the materialist conception of history is that, indeed, materialist analysis applies to everything that has ever existed in history, which necessarily includes trans people. We can't simply choose to apply a bit of Marxism to this and then set it aside for that, no more than we can set aside the law of gravity whenever it conflicts with other beliefs or values we hold. So in this scenario where you believe the person who asserted that trans ideology is idealist is presenting a correct materialist analysis, for whatever reason, you're then forced to choose materialism or transliberation, Marxism or queer emancipation. It can only be one or the other. We either embrace Marxism in its totality, even when its scientific socialist method produces knowledge that conflicts with our previously held beliefs, or we reject it all completely. So if we sincerely are committed students of Marxism and someone with an air of authority who appears to know all the Marxist jargon appears before us, claiming that so-called trans ideology is anti-materialist or bourgeois decadence or whatever, we may end up believing them. After all, we're just trying to be good materialists. But here's the problem. The philosophical underpinning of Marxism is not simply just materialism. It's dialectical materialism. And they're not necessarily the same thing. Marx and Engels were at pains to emphasise this point in order to differentiate themselves from the vulgar mechanical materialists or metaphysical materialists that had come before them, and are still running amok to this day, as we can see. Without dialectics, without a thorough understanding of contradiction, there is no Marxist materialist conception of history. And when you instead apply dialectical materialist analysis to so-called trans ideology, indeed historical materialism to queer oppression more broadly throughout the ages alongside the development of class society, you come to a completely different conclusion than that which the narrow metaphysical materialists posing as Marxists have arrived at. So today we're going to take a look at the root cause of trans oppression, situating it firmly within a historical materialist framework that explains when it began, why it began, and what purpose it served and continues to serve to this day. In order to do this, we're going to examine patriarchy and its dual-pronged oppression of women and LGBT+ people, and how it came to develop during the transition period from primitive communism to class society. We'll then return to the question of metaphysical materialism and dialectical materialism, looking at the complex relationship between matter and consciousness and vice versa, so that we can arrive at a concrete synthesis for how we should understand trans oppression in particular and queer oppression in general from the historical materialist perspective. Following on from this, it'll become clear how we as Marxists should approach queer emancipation in our organising moving forward. But first, if you're new here, go ahead and hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell below for new Marxist educational videos every second Friday, alternating between beginner level Socialism 101 videos and then applying that theory in video essays like this. If you'd like to support Marxist educational content, then toss €1 or $1 per month over on Patreon, which you'll find linked in the description box below. If you're not in a position to support financially but you want to help out, then please share these videos around on social media like Twitter, Reddit, Discord, Instagram, etc. You'd be surprised how much that actually helps, and I'd really appreciate it. Okay, let's take a step back for a moment to consider how we've gotten so deep into this mess with people, even supposed Marxists, being so confused about LGBT plus or queer emancipation and how this struggle fits into the dialectical materialist conception of history. While you can find a substantial body of work on other struggles that may not appear at the surface level to be explicitly class-based, such as women's emancipation and national liberation, unfortunately queer emancipation is massively under-theorised by Marxists. And this vacuum has been filled thus far by liberal and postmodernist centrist theorisation instead. Marxists often shy away from this topic because of the fact that its main theorists to date like Marx, Lenin and Mao simply haven't written about it, at least not directly. And this makes our task a lot more difficult. We can't simply quote Engels in definitive support of this or that particular position. It's impossible to dogmatically phrasemonger excerpts from sacred scripture in order to justify our positions. Most of the necessary work in this area simply hasn't been done yet. Consequently, it falls to Marxists now today to do the heavy lifting of actually applying the dialectical materialist method to queer emancipation. And this is a lot more difficult than simply quoting our favourite revolutionary theorists on a matter and resting our arguments upon their authority. But thankfully, we've been given the tools to do so, and in fact, we don't even need to start from scratch. There already exists within Marxism a substantial theorisation of women's oppression and how this developed historically with the rise of the family, private property, and state. And as we'll see shortly, this is also the starting point for the Marxist analysis of queer antagonism, the analysis of patriarchy. Patriarchy is a dual-pronged mode of oppression, focusing on 1, the oppression of women, and 2, the oppression of queer people. Both of these begin systematically at the exact same moment in history during the transition period between primitive communism and class society. In The Origin of the Family, Private Property and the State, Engels refers to these 3 periods as 1. Savagery, which is primitive communist hunter-gatherer society, 2. Barbarism, which is the transitional stage which introduces pastoralism and agriculture, and 3. Civilization, which is class society beginning with slave society, then feudalism, then capitalism, and so on. Corresponding to each stage is a different form of marriage between people and between groups of people. In primitive communist savagery, group marriage among and between large groups of people is the norm. There was no generalised form of patriarchy at this stage, no prohibitions between who could and couldn't have relations with one another. In barbarism, the transitional stage between primitive communism and class society, there's a move away from group marriage and now pairing marriage begins. Pay close attention here, because this is the stage where we begin to see the emergence of patriarchy. Engels states, in this stage, one man lives with one woman, but the relationship is such that polygamy and occasional infidelity remain the right of the men, even though for economic reasons polygamy is rare, while from the woman the strictest fidelity is generally demanded throughout the time she lives with the man, and adultery on her part is cruelly punished. The marriage tie can, however, be easily dissolved by either partner. After separation, the children still belong, as before, to the mother alone. Note that last part about children belonging to the mother when separation occurs. This is a remnant from primitive communism where people would have multiple sexual partners. This made it often impossible to tell who the biological father of the child was, and this wasn't a concern in a communal environment anyway, as children were raised collectively. The only thing that could be certain here was that the mother gave birth to the child. Therefore, the mother was afforded what is sometimes referred to as mother right due to the definite biological connection there. Consequently, kinship was traced through the mother's line, matrilineage, rather than the father's, and women held higher positions in society as a result. And this mother right remained in the pairing marriages of barbarism as primitive communism's group marriages slowly died out. But something changed during barbarism as class society began to emerge. With the pairing marriage, we begin to see a move away from communal ownership of property and towards private ownership. We see the development of pastoralism and agriculture, which begin to produce a surplus that isn't necessarily held collectively. We see a division of labour emerge, wherein it was the man's part to obtain food and the instruments of labour necessary for the purpose. He therefore also owned the instruments of labour, and in the event of husband and wife separating, he took them with him, just as she retained her household goods. Therefore, according to the social custom of the time, the man was also the owner of the new source of subsistence, the cattle, and later of the new instruments of labour, the slaves. But according to the custom of the same society, his children could not inherit from him. Cattle were breeding and wealth was growing relatively rapidly, far beyond the needs of those in the household. Slaves had children and this labour force grew. With more food, more cattle, and more slaves, with the rise of this new surplus, men in particular grew wealthier and their position within the family became more and more important. But while the matrilineal mother right remained, there was no way for him to pass on his private property to the next generation. What would become of his slaves, his cattle, and so on? Inheritance occurred almost exclusively along the mother's lines. The only way for this private property to be passed down to a man's children to continue to accumulate was if mother right was overthrown and in its place was put a patrilineal system. This would facilitate inheritance based on the male line and allow the accumulation of private property to span across generations, eventually flourishing into full empires. And so, that's what happened. The overthrow of mother right was the world historical defeat of the female sex. The man took command in the home also. The woman was degraded and reduced to servitude. She became the slave of his lust and a mere instrument for the production of children. The patriarchal family was thus born, having successfully subjugated women. In order to ensure that the children who would inherit the property were biologically connected to the father, the pairing marriage now transformed into the monogamous marriage. This brings us to the beginning of class society, from barbarism to the beginnings of civilization, to slave society. The monogamous marriage is based on the supremacy of the man, the express purpose being to produce children of undisputed paternity. Such paternity is demanded because these children are later to come into their father's property as his natural heirs. It is distinguished from pairing marriage by the much greater strength of the marriage tie, which can no longer be dissolved at either partner's wish. As a rule, it is now only the man who can dissolve it and put away his wife. This monogamous marriage, the permanent patriarchal form which facilitates the accumulation of property, is seen clearly in ancient Greek slave society, developing in intensity and becoming more and more generalized geographically as the centuries pass. And this of course could only be facilitated and generalized with the development of the slave state, which enforced private property relations and male supremacy, violently punishing all those who challenged it in any way. And this continued with the feudal state and continues to this day with the capitalist state, each form of state of course manifesting with its own unique characteristics. Patriarchy and the patriarchal family exist to this day to facilitate inheritance and the accumulation of capital as well as the reproduction of labour. In other words, to protect and grow private property and to ensure that people are able to labour with that private property in order to further accumulate capital for the ruling class. Anyone who impedes this process is punished accordingly. And the two groups that are incentivized most to do this, the two groups whose freedom is inherently at odds with this state of affairs, are women and LGBT+ people. Now, a lazy-bone book worshipper who insists on solely adhering to the exact words written by Marx and Engels may say, hang on, there wasn't explicit mention of LGBT+ people in the origin story of patriarchy as laid out by Engels. And that's true. Which is why we, as Marxists in the 21st century, have to continue to creatively apply the scientific socialist methods to fill in the gaps and flesh this out further. Marxism is, after all, a developing science, the denial of which amounts to little more than dogmatic revisionism. So let's take a moment to look back at the three stages, savagery, barbarism and civilization, to see how queer antagonism develops over time. Like how there's no generalised patriarchal oppression of women in primitive communism with its group marriages, there's no evidence of queer antagonism in savage society, but plenty of evidence which suggests bisexuality as the main form of human attraction. All primates observed in nature have bisexual tendencies, with bonobo apes being fully bisexual. Neanderthals were commonly buried with partners of both sexes, the leading hypothesis being that they were all bisexual. And this should come as no surprise. There simply isn't a material basis for antagonism towards non-cishet people at this stage of development. There's no challenge presented to the accumulation of private property because it doesn't exist. And consequently, you can find what would now be considered queer themes throughout ancient mythology describing pre-class society all across the world. In Africa, the Americas, Asia, Oceania, Europe, etc. Even here in Ireland, our own Hercules, Cuchulainn, the great hero of Irish mythology, appears to have had a romantic and even sexual relationship with another man, Ferdiad, indicating little or no generalised antagonism towards such relations in pre-Christian Celtic Ireland. Indeed, across the globe, in primitive society, there was a widespread system of third gender institutions. These were systems of acceptance and respect for people who today would be understood as queer. Homosexuals, bisexuals, transgender people, asexuals, intersex people, non-binary people, etc. But this all changes with the overthrow of mother right and the emergence of the patrilineal patriarchal family unit ushered in by monogamous marriage as we transition from barbarism to civilization. LGBT+ people's freedom inherently challenged patriarchal accumulation of private property. So, queer people, only now really becoming a separate group in opposition to the standard patriarchal family that facilitated the accumulation of property, were subjugated and oppressed accordingly, forced to conform to new societal norms imposed by patriarchy and enforced by the burgeoning slave state. With the establishment of slavery, the slave-owning state, and the slave-owner patriarchal family, it became necessary to systematize the sexual customs of primitive society and codify them as law and religion. Thus, the category queer was established as a category of those who qualitatively diverged from the norms and laws of the patriarchal family, although this category had different names or no names at all across time and place. With the rise of civilization and the slave state, a strict gender binary and sexual norms become codified and generalized over time. In the early stages of slave society, there are exceptions to this, such as certain homosexual practices being permitted in ancient Greece among those who had already fulfilled their commitments to the patriarchal family and the accumulation of private property. However, the condition of queer people in slave society was characterized by ever-increasing restrictions culturally and legally, and this continues with the transition to feudalism, becoming especially harsh in places like medieval Europe, where people were regularly put to death for engaging in non-heterosexual sex. It would then further intensify with Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century, expanding to putting people to death for merely homosexual attraction, regardless of whether or not any act had even been engaged in. Patriarchal oppression of both women and LGBT+ people was extremely intense at this moment in time and place, and continued over the coming centuries. When the witch burnings began, both groups would experience its horrific brutality. From the despicable practice of witch burnings comes the English term faggot, which refers to the Tudor practice of using gay men as firewood for the witch burning pyres. This also serves as a fitting metaphor for the relationship between the patriarchal oppression of women and of queers. Patriarchy's dual oppression of women and LGBT+ people is demonstrated perhaps more strikingly here than at any other point in history. And of course, this patriarchal oppression continues with the transition from feudalism to capitalism, taking us up to this very day at the highest stage of capitalism, that is, capitalism imperialism. The bourgeois nuclear family is upheld as the standard, and even in countries where queers have conquered a large amount of daily demands, they're still only permitted to be queer when they enter into bourgeois families themselves and participate as auxiliaries in the reproduction of labour, for instance, through adoption of orphans' children. In other words, LGBT+ people today are forced to assimilate to the patriarchal family unit, fulfilling its primary functions of protecting private property and ensuring the reproduction of labour. And of course, we see this play out regularly where onlookers will often see, for example, a lesbian couple and designate one of them as the man in the relationship and the other to be the woman, forcing them into the roles of the patriarchal family unit regardless of gender or sexual orientation. Queer people in general, and trans people in particular, are subjected to huge amounts of oppression in today's society, including so-called sodomy laws, forced homelessness, unemployability, forced prostitution, domestic abuse, and a particular favourite of the bourgeoisie in countries where queer rights were conquered in name only, pogromist violence. And that's just what's happening right now under today's capitalism. We haven't even mentioned the horrific genocidal slaughtering of queer people over the course of 20th century capitalism, particularly but not exclusively under fascist regimes. Now, we've already established the material basis for patriarchal oppression of women and queer people as a consequence of their freedom disrupting inheritance and impeding the patriarchal accumulation of capital and the reproduction of labour. But it's also important to understand the post hoc ideological justifications for this oppression which have emerged at the superstructural level from the ruling classes and those who serve their interests. Where the essence of the ideological oppression of women is the conception of the deficient female nature, the essence of the ideological oppression of queers is the conception of the degenerated or divergent elements, who are to be forcefully integrated with or purged from patriarchal society for the health of the people. In Europe and the Americas, ruling class queer antagonistic ideology has been heavily reinforced by Christianity and its notions of sin and sodomy, while taking other forms in different parts of the world. Such ideology is only propagated by the most openly reactionary forces of the ruling class and its lackeys. But there's another form of queer antagonistic ideology which is present in the proletarian movement, both in the labour movement and in the international communist movement. This is the problem of sexual metaphysics, or queer antagonistic revisionism. Now, you'll recall that we briefly touched on the problem of metaphysical or mechanical materialism earlier on. Let's take a moment to explain the differences between metaphysical materialism and dialectical materialism so that we can better unpack the revisionist queer antagonistic ideology of sexual metaphysics that has crept into the proletarian movement. So, what do we mean when we talk about metaphysics? Engels writes in Socialism, Utopian and Scientific, to the metaphysician, things and their mental reflexes, ideas, are isolated, are to be considered one after the other and apart from each other, are objects of investigation fixed, rigid, given once for all. For him, a thing either exists or does not exist. A thing cannot at the same time be itself and something else. Positive and negative absolutely exclude one another. Cause and effect stand in rigid antithesis, one to the other. Dialectics, on the other hand, comprehends things and their representations, ideas, in their essential connection, concatenation, motion, origin, and ending. In other words, metaphysics views things as static, isolated, and rigidly fixed in one place, almost existing in a kind of vacuum. Dialectics, on the other hand, views everything as interconnected and constantly in motion, that is, constantly changing as a result of the struggle of opposing forces within and between all things, internal and external contradictions. This includes matter and consciousness, the material and the ideal. As Heraclitus stated, you could not step twice into the same river, or, the sometimes expanded version, no man ever steps in the same river twice, for it's not the same river, and he's not the same man. Nothing is permanent except change. In the right circumstances, things can even change into their polar opposite. Day can become night, life can become death, the oppressed can become the oppressors, and so on and so forth. If this is new to you and you're curious to learn more, have a look at the Socialism 101 videos on Dialectical Materialism, Historical Materialism, and perhaps most importantly on Contradiction, and dive into the reading lists in the description box below each of those videos. Now, people studying Marxism rarely struggle to grasp materialism. It's a fairly straightforward concept. All existence begins with matter. However, a lot of people really struggle with dialectics, even Marxists who've been at it for years. So because it's easier to grasp materialism, we often end up seeing aspiring Marxists using materialism without dialectics. This all materialism, no dialectics approach is metaphysical materialism, or sometimes called mechanical materialism. This is not Marxist dialectical materialism. Engels is at pains in the second chapter of Socialism, Utopian and Scientific to explain that scientific socialist analysis can only be engaged in on the philosophical basis of explicitly dialectical materialism, not metaphysical materialism. Indeed, all kinds of people employ mechanical materialism. It's the basis of most modern science. But that doesn't make all modern scientific inquiry necessarily Marxist, as it doesn't necessarily employ the historical materialist method upon the philosophical basis of dialectical materialism. And we can see how this mechanical, undialectical approach may lead to all kinds of deviations from Marxism, such as the aforementioned sexual metaphysics. This falls into the trap that Engels warned us about of seeing matter and consciousness as two separate, static, isolated things that don't exist in any kind of dialectical relationship with one another. Mao Zedong also warned of this kind of metaphysical thinking in the short text, Where the Correct Ideas Come From. Among our comrades, there are many who do not yet understand the Marxist theory of knowledge. When asked the source of their ideas, opinions, policies, methods, plans and conclusions, eloquent speeches and long articles, they consider the question strange and cannot answer it. Nor do they comprehend that matter can be transformed into consciousness and consciousness into matter, although such leaps are phenomena of everyday life. Indeed, Mao highlights in this text and in On Practice that ideas become a material force through social practice. So when it's claimed that being trans is just inherently idealist, this is completely incorrect from the dialectical materialist perspective, failing to grasp the relationship between the material and the ideal and vice versa, how consciousness becomes matter and matter becomes consciousness through social practice and so on and so forth. This claim that being trans is idealist is vulgar sexual metaphysics that has nothing to do with Marxism. Right, now that we've established a basic understanding of what metaphysics is as opposed to dialectics, let's properly flesh out what exactly sexual metaphysics refers to. Sexual metaphysics is essentially negating the queer question by either talking it out of existence or portraying queers as degenerates by using Marxist terminology. It is smuggling bourgeois patriarchal prejudice into the proletariat through phrasemongering. Important specific aspects of sexual metaphysics include the idea that transgender people cannot materially become their desired sex and are therefore just ruining their bodies. That queers cannot be communists because homosexuality is a bourgeois individualist ideology, and that a marriage is between a man and a woman, meaning that homosexuals don't struggle against patriarchy in their personal lives. With regard to someone identifying as trans, dialectical materialist analysis would examine the various opposing forces or contradictions at play which have given rise to this person identifying as the particular gender or indeed as non-binary. Now, the contradictions at play will differ according to the particular person and the particular situation. For example, whether one has gender dysphoria or not. But to demonstrate how a scientific socialist analysis for each of these phenomena may occur, let's take an example of someone with gender dysphoria who transitions. Here we might see an antagonistic contradiction between their psychological view of themselves, which is physically located in the body map of the brain or homunculus, and their physical body, on which basis a contradiction to societal gender roles is also established. Since ideas can be turned into material reality through practice, it is possible to change one's sex and gender roles, philosophically speaking. With hormones and/or surgery, it is possible to change one's secondary sexual characteristics, fat distribution, hair growth, voice, breasts, bone growth, etc. completely, and even parts of one's primary sexual characteristics, genitals, chromosomes. Of these, the secondary sexual characteristics determine what role one occupies in society. For this reason, transgender people materially become their desired gender when they transition, and it is sexual metaphysics to suggest otherwise. Now, of course, this is just one example. The analysis of contradictions will be slightly different in the cases of trans people without gender dysphoria, as well as for non-binary people, but the material reality remains the same. Nonetheless, this work is still ongoing and falls to the dialectical materialists of today to complete in order to account for the different variations that exist. It's our job as Marxists to sweep away revisionist sexual metaphysics and all other kinds of bourgeois patriarchal ideological intrusions upon the proletarian movement, and push forward with this work in concert with the people through the mass line. Now, so far I haven't bothered trying to dismantle the notion that trans identity is idealist using the mechanical materialist framework, because as Marxists we focus on dialectical materialism. But it probably is worth highlighting that this assertion fails even by its own metaphysical standards. The very existence of intersex people completely destabilizes all notions of some simple, static, fixed, definitive sex binary. In fact, any single factor that's deemed to be the determining factor for whether a person is male or female, when put under any kind of scrutiny, immediately disappears. People often point to chromosomes or genitalia as the definitive factors, but of course there are people with XX chromosomes and typically male genitalia who live their entire lives as men. Likewise, there are people with XY chromosomes and typically female genitalia who live their entire lives as women. And that's not even getting into the various other chromosomal variations that exist. Some assert that women menstruate and can get pregnant and give birth, that this is the defining factor of womanhood. But of course, it's a fact that many women are not able to do these, and this can be related to any number of factors including various conditions or even simply age. So even when you try to take the most rigid, isolated, static, reductionist, metaphysical materialist approach for determining the decisive factor in a person's sex, let alone gender, it completely falls apart under any kind of scrutiny. The assertion that being trans is idealist fails even on its own metaphysical materialist terms. So no, trans identity, whether talking about gender or even sex, is not inherently anti-materialist or idealist. Not from a mechanical materialist perspective, and definitely not from the dialectical materialist Marxist perspective. Any analysis that claims trans identity is inherently idealist has nothing to do with Marxism and everything to do with sexual metaphysics. Trans identity, with or without gender dysphoria, as well as non-binary identities, are completely coherent within the framework of dialectical materialism through a concrete analysis of contradiction and comprehension of the transformations from matter to consciousness and consciousness to matter. A comprehension of how material forces come into existence through social practice. As communists, it's important that we understand that the fight for trans liberation is the fight for queer emancipation. The fight for queer emancipation is the fight against patriarchy, and the fight against patriarchy is the fight against class society itself and the private property upon which it's based. That is to say, this is the fight for stateless, classless, moneyless society. The fight for communism. If you're watching this and you're in an organisation with a metaphysical, revisionist, queer antagonistic and particularly trans antagonistic line, you need to line struggle against it and fight for the proletarian line of supporting queer emancipation, dismantling patriarchy and moving beyond class society. And if you're not in a revolutionary organisation, join one. The revolution is not an apple that falls when it's ripe. You have to make it fall. Now, this video has been heavily based on a few texts that I strongly recommend reading. Firstly, Friedrich Engels' The Origin of the Family, Private Property and the State, which thoroughly fleshes out where patriarchy comes from and why. Also check out his work Socialism, Utopian and Scientific to further explain the differences between metaphysical materialism and dialectical materialism. Next, Marxism and Queer Emancipation by the Swiss comrades over at the Red Flag. This is hands down the most advanced and comprehensive Marxist analysis of queer oppression I've ever read. There are a couple of points in it that I take issue with, but if you can overlook those, it's head and shoulders above any other scientific socialist analysis of the topic that exists right now, at least in my opinion. The final works that have been heavily drawn on for this video would be the 5 essays on philosophy by Mao Zedong. If you're struggling with the dialectical understanding of how the material becomes the ideal and how the ideal becomes the material, how matter becomes consciousness and how consciousness becomes matter, I strongly recommend having a read of the very short Where the Correct Ideas Come From, then On Practice. The two of those will give you a fairly solid grasp of the Marxist theory of knowledge. You'll then want to have a read of On Contradiction to reinforce and develop your understanding of dialectics to make sure you don't fall into the trappings of metaphysical materialism, least of all sexual metaphysics. And then on the correct handling of contradictions among the people to see how we put all of this knowledge into practice in our organising. Just read all of Mao's writing. It's class, you'll love it. All the texts mentioned are linked in the description box below. I strongly recommend diving into them as this video has barely scratched the surface of these important and complex topics. Right, thanks very much for watching this video. Hopefully you found it useful as some kind of introduction to this developing field of study within Marxism. Thanks especially to the supporters on Patreon who've made this video possible. Thank you Ian McShay, Ugopnik, Borku Gorilla, Ryan Hodgson, Soup, Madeline, Sonic232, Sagan, Michaela Schmid, Christian Napalis, Brian Ruse, Alfonso Dingo Torres, Mekalova, Rockgardist, Grangry, Todd Sprang, Nike the Sage, Zakasi, Anglo-Irish Bolshevik, Eli Leslie, Train Age 13, Meowsifer, Hunter Johnson, Donald O'Quishleva, Sixney Velan, Kale Marks, Roja, MLM in Practice, Eric Lindahl, ZK Goody, Laverna Wintermore, Kyle Rapp, Vuchko, Doc Toma, Oyub Farah, Becky, Pastor Schubert, A Mouthwash Bottle, Mr. Miyamoto, Kyle King, Reverend Londom Hollywood, Wonderbad, JT Chapman, Jose, Joseph Shepard, Jack Schneidman, Comrade Amara, Wealth for the 99%, Spoop, and Trailer Park Communists. Cheers everyone, agus slán go fóill.